So let me introduce our next speaker, Rachel Rivenc, who has been part of the Modern and Contemporary Art Initiative within the Getty Conservation Institute since 2007. She's currently in the Collections Department, where she oversees the dissemination, training, and research activities related to modern and contemporary art. In 2016, Rachel published her groundbreaking book, Made in Los Angeles: Materials, Processes, and the Birth of West Coast Minimalism. Amongst other artists, including Larry Bell, Craig Kaufman, and John McCracken, she discusses Robert Irwin's prolific body of work charting the changes and development in his techniques and intentions. Rachel's research provides precious information for the future preservation of Irwin's work, especially once the artist and his fabricator are no longer with us. In today's talk, A Tale of an Artist and His Fabricator, Robert Irwin and Jack Brogan, Rachel will highlight the unique collaboration between the outstanding minimalist artist and Jack Brogan, the longtime go-to fabricator and restorer for many LA-based artists. Please welcome Rachel.
So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work of Bob Irwin. Notoriously, he's one of the pioneers of the light and space movement, although he dislikes this. He doesn't really identify with his name. He dislikes all labels, as he will readily tell you. And he's also this artist who, having undergone this really drastic process of phenomenological reduction, essentially renounced materiality to really focus on perception as the subject of his art, and some might argue even as his medium. But I'll get back a little bit on that in the course of this talk. I earlier today or yesterday, I asked Francesca and Jeffrey if we could swap the order of our talks, because I thought theirs being much broader in scope would set the scene greatly for mine. And now, of course, I'm biting my fingers because it's a really hard act to follow. The scope of their research, the amount of material amassed is really impressive, and the sophistication of their thinking. So I'm just going to embrace what this is, which is a much more sort of intimate, focused, little story. And I'm going to do a personal and maybe somewhat a little goofy introduction. I've had several conversations with Bob Irwin in the past few years, and almost every time I came out of these conversations feeling a little shaken, like a little agitated, and I couldn't really understand why. And what came out, I was like, my God, I just talked to a genius. And I know it's a big word and one that's somewhat meaningless, but I think what I was expressing with that is the idea that his thinking is so original, so personal, so rooted in intimate and deep conviction that it's really completely compelling, meaning it takes you with it. And in fact, I came out thinking, why am I not an artist? But of course, because I don't have that kind of drive and talent, probably. But okay, I'm deviating now. Let's get back to the focus. But Bob Irwin does not stand alone in that, and he did not get there alone either. And in fact, the subject of this talk is his sort of lifelong friendship and relationship with his fabricator, Jack Brogan. And here they are in the 70s. And in fact, it's a theme with the genius thing, because Bob Irwin calls Jack a materials genius. As Delia mentioned, this is some research that's coming out of a book I previously published, but it's now the research continues on this very specific topic of the relationship between Jack and Bob. And it's at the invitation of Mariana Stocker-Brand, who is the editor-in-chief for the catalog Raisonné, and she on Bob Irwin, and she really wanted to have Jack feature in that Raisonné, given the importance of his contribution for Bob's art. And I wanted to do a shout out to Ariella Albers, who's here and is also working on the Raisonné. And then before I dive in any further, I also want to thank Christian and Natalie and everyone else for this symposium. Like, some amazing questions are coming out of this. So these are the same two men a couple of years ago, well into their 80s now, conversely, I think the relationship with Jack has really enabled Bob to do some things that he might not have been able to do otherwise. And I just wanted to read this. He said, "Having one person as a resource is the biggest asset. My association with Jack enabled me to work the way I do now. I can call him and ask him in which direction to go with a project. Jack has really influenced my thinking in terms of how I solve problems." And I think we will see. I will, go briefly over the story of this relationship and some of the results he's produced. Obviously, Jack has fabricated many objects for Bob, but he's also been acting as a general contractor for some of the later conditional art, site-specific projects, and I think has become a sort of like just sort of almost psychological assistance, or someone that Bob really goes to for all kind of problems. And reversing the relationship, one of the many aspects of this relationship that amazed me is that Jack, who really is a Southern gentleman from Tennessee with from his own admission, no formal education whatsoever, certainly not in the art, has from a very early stage recognized how special was what Bob was doing, and really got a kick out of it and said, "This is great, I want to be a part of it, I want to contribute." And in the beginning there was no money in what they were doing whatsoever, and Jack has really put in a lot of his time, of effort, and probably lost money, which I'm sure he recovered later, but into producing these works. So now I think that's what I wanted to say in terms of introduction. Again, in the personal vein, I would just say that I'm very fond of both men. Their creativity and their commitment to their work well into their 80s, almost 90s for Bob is really a constant source of amazement and inspiration. So Bob was part of a group of artists in Los Angeles who for the most part started as painters and had a very formative phase of abstract expressionism. This is one of Bob's early work, very, very different from what he's done later. A lot of them had an association with a much storied Ferris gallery, and then underwent, as a group, this process of sort of formal reduction that took them a little closer to some of what was happening in New York with artists such as Judd, Andre, Morris, etc. And this is Bob's disc from the late 60s and column from the early 70s. And this is other artists that from a group that has been loosely associated, to the point that it has been dubbed on occasion West Coast minimalism. But this is also controversial because, of course, many art historians and critics have pointed out some of the differences, in particular, as you can see even from that picture, even though Bob's work is not in it, but the bright color, the reflective surfaces, and then the attention to perception that, of course, blossom later in light and space. But just to also continue in this opposition, like this group of artists were really not only quite macho, as you can tell, but also quite resolutely anti-intellectual in the posturing, which is really interesting when you think that Bob Irwin then went on to educate himself by himself, not only on art history, but also philosophy, voraciously reading Husserl and other philosophers volume after volume, writing in the margins, and then producing his own writing. And he's told me he would spend hours writing notes on these, what he'd been reading, and then he would start over again if he was not satisfied not only with the content of what he had written, but also with the way it looked. And that's the type of artist that Bob Irwin is. Excuse me. Among differences between New York and LA, and I realize it's kind of funny that LA is always obsessed with pointing out these differences, but of course, in this process of formal reduction, the use of industrial materials and methods have been completely crucial and pivotal, as it was in New York, and as was delegation. One difference, perhaps, is that in LA, the presence of a very booming aerospace industry, but also leisure industry, that including the making of boats, of surfboards, things like that, made that some materials, notoriously plastics, were probably more present in the general consciousness, including that of artists, and more readily available to use as in their palette of materials. And Bob Irwin has made extensive use of plastics, as other artists have. Another thing that was quite specific to LA, probably, is the extensive presence of specialty shops, which were small, often highly specialized shops, specialized in one material or one process, often working for aerospace industry or more high-tech industries, and in this way acted also as the vulgarizers of techniques and materials. And these shops enable artists to use materials and processes that were industrial in nature, but also to retain a certain amount of participation in the process. And that's perhaps another thing that is quite specific to LA. Artists often retained a large amount of participation in the process. It's not often full delegation. And in fact, Irwin himself marveled at the fact that in California there is like a large amount of people into really eccentric specialties, from aerospace industry to car making or boat. And you can find pretty much every single skill that you would dream of under the sun. Now, in this general landscape, both Jack and Bob are somewhat oddities because unlike other LA artists who really embraced one process, one material, and stuck with it, Bob embraced delegation very early on because he did not want to be limited to one material or to one process. And he immediately saw, and I'll go through that through his work a little bit, he immediately saw the need for delegation. And Jack was also an exception to this idea of very specialized shops because, so I mentioned Jack came from Tennessee. He embraced, he's really like a jack of all trades. He's a talented man who can pick up any manual skill seemingly quite easily. So in Tennessee, there's a rumor that he dabbled in hot rodding to carry moonshine, but little is known of that. He also worked in concrete block making and had a little spell as an analytical chemist in a lab, helping to prepare chemical. Upon which he came to LA and had a furniture shop and worked with home developers to fabricate furniture and accessory for their model homes. At that point, his shop burned and he found employment at another cabinet maker, and that's when he met Bob Irwin, and reopened his own shop in 1965 under the name Design Concept. And unlike the specialized shops I mentioned, Design Concept was instead of focusing on one material, on one process, really offered just a general problem-solving approach. And in fact, they're really a convincing argument for the link between aerospace industry and art, because they, between 1965 and 1975, a large portion of their business came from the aerospace industry, corporations like Lockheed Corporation or Garrett. That's the leaflet that we see on screen right now with Jack Brogan in the center. And his shop made essentially prototypes or mock-ups, material mock-ups of all kind of space things or anything that was needed for these corporations. So it's this very general problem-solving approach that made him an indispensable resource for Bob Irwin and then rapidly for a whole bunch of LA artists, to the point that he really became the go-to fabricator for them and later restorer. And I'll get back to that too, of course. And now I'll outline a little bit briefly in Bob's trajectory what pushed him to feel the need for delegation. And so I showed one of his large abstract expressionist canvas earlier. These are his paintings. He describes them as the first attempt not to paint a painting. You can see the evolution over the course of a few years from the pickup stick paintings on the left to the very minimal, if I can use this term, line paintings on the right, where you can barely see, it's not a complete monochrome, but you can barely see the two lines. Irwin's interest it's never really conceptual. It's always in perception, and there is always intuition and centrality about it. The spacing of the lines is completely intuitive, and the reason for is like he wants your eye to oscillate between the two and never being able to really encompass these two together. So it's the start of his interest in perception, and it's also the start for him. He's still a painter at this point, but his process becomes really difficult and exacting. And it's also the start of the whole mystique surrounding his art, where he planted a chair at a certain distance in front of the canvas and had people come and sit in them to contemplate the paintings, and the whole thing required certain specific conditions to be really watched and viewed properly. The next step, Bob describes his art as a series of questions that he answered before moving on to the next, are the dot paintings, and that's really when he started to feel the need to enlist help for the fabrication. So these paintings are shaped not the edges, but with a curvature in the center, which is very important because for Bob it gives the painting presence. And to achieve that, there's a very complex system inside that he compares to an old-fashioned airplane wing of wooden struts, creating this with a wooden veneer, creating this curvature. And this on the left is a drawing that Bob made for me because he thought I had completely misunderstood what he meant. So at this point, he went to Lucius Hudson, who's the stretcher maker for all the LA painters at the time, and who said, "I'm sorry, Bob, this is beyond me, I can't help you," and sent him to the cabinet maker where Jack was working at the time. And that's how Jack and Bob met, although I don't know if Bob is completely aware of that, but apparently Jack had been seeing Bob and his gang of friends hanging out at a bar and was rather fascinated, it seemed. The painting element, again, is still done solely by Bob. It's a system of dots in complementary color, which, again, instead of having a full monochrome, provide a vibration, which is important to the perception of the work. The next series of work, the discs, I'm going quite quickly through that because I really want to highlight Jack's kind of incrementally important participation in these. The next series of work are the disc. The first one were made in aluminum, and the second ones in plastic, and in acrylic PMMA plastic. Like plexiglass. And Bob always wanted to make them in plastic to really exploit the quality of transparency of the plastic. But at the beginning, he could not make them. They also have a curvature like that. And the plastic disc would simply flop under their own weight. So here again, Jack was marginally involved. He helped him source the people who fabricated the substrates. So for the aluminum disc, a place called California Metal Shaping. These are the highly specialized specialty shops I was talking about. So it's a shop that was fabricating handmade parts for race cars. And Jack remembered that the guy who worked with Bob was called Carl Red, and he hammered by hands the metal shape from a wooden form provided by Bob. And then Jack also apparently was instrumental in finding the solution to eventually be able to fabricate the disc out of plastic. He again went out and found a company called Planet Plastics. And what they found out is that they needed to have this sort of system of, I don't know if you see it on the left, like a bulge in the center. So it's like a double crown. And the bulge in the center it's subtle, but it's essentially what prevents the disc from just flopping. Jack, again, instrumental in sourcing these places, but also in designing the mounting of both systems. They're the same. Basically for the plastic disc and the aluminum one, meaning a tube or cylinder. In the case of the plastic, it's commercially bought. In the case of the metal one, it's custom made. So this tube gets screwed into the wall and then comes into this shorter cylinder that's attached to the piece. And again, the painting part is still done by Bob himself with his own hand. At this time, it's spray painting using industrial paints and a spray gun, but it's still done by him. The next series of objects, however, is really, I would say, sealed the collaboration between the two men. It's a series of objects that Bob calls very sort of dramatically my last object before my transition out of painting and sculpture, or out of objecthood altogether, which is ironic because at the same time they're incredibly elegant and beautiful objects. So they're basically these tall columns made again of acrylic plastic. They have two shapes, either chevron or sort of like wings, and initially, they were made out of. They act as prisms, so they basically refract light. And the idea is you barely notice them when you enter a room where they're installed, only by maybe like a flash of light or a slight distortion of your perception. Of course, it makes them incredibly difficult to display because very often people just don't see them and bump into them. And if you put marking on the floor, you completely betray the intention of the piece, which many museums resort to by putting guards, but of course that means staffing and costs. And this is Bob in his studio. I can't remember if he's swiping or painting, but so the difficulty with these pieces was multifold. First of all, at the time, these documents come either from Bob's paper in the Getty Research Institute or from Jack's archive. At the time, they could only buy the pieces of plastic in a certain length and a certain thickness. Casting larger amounts was impossible because the heat it produced made the plastic crumble. And this is a catalog from Cadillac Plastic, where they source these pieces of plastic. So what Jack had to do, essentially, I wish this pointer worked. I don't know if you see it on the image that's on the left high up. You see the pieces of plastics lined up on a table, ready to be assembled. So the difficulties that Jack had to face were several-fold. The first one was find a way to assemble these things in an invisible fashion. And what he did is called solvent welding. So first of all, polishing perfectly both surfaces to be welded so that no air would exist in between, and then immerse them in solvent, and then just join them and apply an incredible amount of pressure. And the way he did that with a clamping system and with adapting a sort of hydraulic pressure system made for lowering and raising truck gates. And he said, no, I don't know, I might patent this. I was like, Jack, this was in 1970. I'm not sure that's going to work, but whatever. So that was the first difficulty that he faced, and that he solved beautifully, because most of the time the seam is practically invisible or completely invisible. And then the second difficulty that he has to face was to send the surface of the plastic to a level of optical perfection that it'd be practically invisible, except for the slight change in refractive index of the light passing through. And at the time, apparently there was no compound that permitted you to do that. So what Jack had to do, and that's interesting, that's where his knowledge as his little stint as in a chemical lab came in. He remembered the oxides that he had used, and he sorted these oxides, which are basically oxides that you would use in paints as paint fillers. And he used the principle of chromatography in a very crude way by filling a big bathtub with water, dumping the oxides in it, and then the smaller one, the finer one, would just raise to the surface, upon which he would collect them and slowly sort them. So I don't know if you can even imagine how incredibly time-consuming that would be. And then, of course, there's the time-consuming aspect of the actual sanding and polishing. So yeah, and there's really like a mythical aura around the making of these columns, but that's how he that's how they made it. And in fact, that's also the moment where I think Bob really completely gave up on the making works himself and decided that he was content just completely delegating. In fact, Jack loves to tell this anecdote where at the beginning he would come in every day and insist on sand and polish things himself, and after about a week or so where he saw he was getting nowhere, finally gave up and decided to let Jack and his workers just do it. The column we see here on screen is the Northridge Column. That's a very large column that was installed in the Northridge Fashion Center. It's about 33 feet high. And for this one, they had the Cadillac Plastic and Chemical Company custom cast 3 large pieces with a system of vacuum preventing the heat buildup. And at Jack's request, they introduced a UV stabilizer in the plastic. And that's the mounting system for the column that also Jack and Bob designed together. That's more sanding in Jack's shop. Bob pretending to sand or just giving direction or just happily watching Jack do the job. This is more Stockman, and that's the installation of the column at Northridge to give you an idea of the scale. So in the 2000s, they started remaking these columns. Jack's also the only person who can repair them in an invisible manner, or at least it would appear so far. So in addition to being the go-to fabricator for LA artists, Jack has also become the go-to restorer for a lot of them, and I'll get back to that. These are the ones they're remaking since the 2000s. They're very happy because now they come in longer stretch, longer length, and so less seams are necessary. So they're taller, even more elegant, and the plastic has apparently greater optical clarity these days. Beyond the objects, I mentioned that Jack has been a constant companion in all of Bob's endeavor, and this is the cardboard furniture that they did together. It started when Bob did the first National Symposium for Habitability with NASA in his studio in the early 70s, where Jack helped him basically build the space and modify the space to provide different experiences to the participants. And that's Bob installing one of his screen pieces. That's the one that was at the Met Breyers. That was at the Whitney, now Met Breyers. And so at the beginning, Jack would help him. Now Bob has another fabricator that does only his screen pieces, but at the beginning, Jack would help him do anything, and that was at the Walker Art Center, a very beautiful installation also at the Walker, sorry. Other projects that Jack helped on occasionally, there's the Getty Garden, of course, and Jack made these metal structures, but also was just generally present, as I mentioned, almost as psychological support, as in the difficult meetings with the notorious ego clashes with Richard Meyer, the architect. So just a constant presence in Bob's life. These are more recent work. Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue 3, installed at Pace, London. I think it's 2013. So these, again, are made by Jack. Here's his shop. Nowadays, his shop is simply called Brogan Studio. And they're honeycomb panels that are then primed and then painted with industrial automotive paints and sanded again to perfection to a mirror finish. And these are pieces that they're working on together now. You will see the final product, if you wish, in May at Pace here in New York. So that's a collaboration that started earlier in 2017. The plexiglass is colored plexiglass that comes from Japan that Bob's very happy with, but at a visual level, I'm not completely sure how it works right now. What I wanted to also raise with this whole story is the question of this very, very symbiotic, intimate and symbiotic link between the artist and the fabricator and the object, where the fabricator, it's, you're right, Jeffrey, you mentioned like a copy was the big deal, the artist didn't make the thing himself, but in that case, it's constantly the same person, and there is this symbiotic link between artist, fabricator, and object, to the point that the fabricator is almost the hand of the artist, or at least the extension of the hand of the artist. The questions it raises for the future, for our understanding, interpretation of the objects, and of course for the general legacy and for the conservation. So, but that it does mean that this link that exists between the artist and his work, that when a work is acquired by a museum and all of a sudden the artist is like, they won't let me touch my work. Well, this link is prolonged through the mediation of Jack, where there is this idea that it's the making of the work is not completely ended. It's occur when he works on the pieces. I'm not sure I'm wording that very well, but that could be questions for further discussion. I think as Bob moved into more the realm of, one could call it public art, he calls it conditional art, and moved on to larger and larger projects. He often says he would take on a whole city if he could. It's become obvious that his project more and more involved collaboration and negotiations on a large scale. And I think something that is very obvious is that Bob loves working with people, and he loves finding people. He loves finding people with high level of skill and craft, and the same idea of exactness and preciseness that he has. And he really found that in Jack. And in fact, as evidence of their friendship, Bob told me, well, I have salt custom made for me for Hawaii that I carry with me all the time, and Jack has a vial of pepper that he has in his jacket at all times that comes from Paris. So you see, we're just alike. But beyond the anecdote, I just wanted to highlight that beautiful and productive friendship, and also just mention something that Jack told me once when I asked him, if I find it, I asked him if he never got bored of all this repetitive sanding. And he said, there's things that I've done over the years, part of them that get boring. But a lot of time in doing that, make a mistake and learn something. Then you have to come up and create something new. And so it's very interesting. And he gave the example of Irwin columns for that. Sometimes it gets expensive because when you say you can do something, and you have to do it, I always do it. I would go out and complete it no matter what. And in the meantime, you learn something new. And it's fun to do that. And you hope you can pay your bills. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.